Everyone. Welcome to this presentation on the concept of listening. So today I will discuss listening, and I then present different perspectives on listening. And then I present an organizing framework, followed by a theoretical framework, which I developed rather recently into 2017. And then, if I find time, I'll talk about listening assessments a little bit. So let's get started with the presentation, and let's look at the sources that I'm using. The first paper that I'm using is from Bodhi and his colleagues, which is published in 2008. It's a very interesting and comprehensive review of the concept of listening from three perspectives, which was published in the International Journal of Listening. And then, like I said, I will use another paper, which I published in the same journal in 2017. And then Burleson, again, a paper published in the International Journal of Listening, which is actually a constructivist approach to listening comprehension. Now, here is the International Journal of Listening, if you're interested to take a look. Actually, this specific focus of the journal, as the name implies, is listening itself from different perspectives. Okay, so let's get started with the definitions and perspectives on listening. Listening is a multidisciplinary field, and we cannot say that one particular definition would satisfy the expectations of all scholars across all the fields. One of the definitions that has been proposed is the one that I proposed in 2017. It's simple, but I think it's relatively comprehensive in the sense that it focuses on both top-down and bottom-up processing. And I'll talk about those two processes soon in this presentation. Well, basically, it reads like this. The listening and comprehension from a general perspective is a process of extracting meaning from perceptual, visual, and/or oral stimuli. So it has to do with extracting meaning from what you hear or what you read or what you see. When it comes to listening, it's about extracting meaning from what you hear. Another definition has been proposed by Burleson, which goes like this. It's the activity of interpreting the verbal communicative behavior of others in the effort to understand the meaning of that behavior. And as you see here, the word meaning also has been stressed, as well as communicative behavior, because Burleson's viewpoint basically has to do with the communication theory and communicative competency. And therefore, another main concept in this definition is the concept of communication. Then the last definition here is the one that has been presented by the International Listening Association in 2012, which defines listening as a process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken or nonverbal messages. Again, as you see, the word meaning is important here. And that's actually one of the fundamental concepts that we're going to discuss in this presentation today. So Bodhi and his colleagues present three perspectives on listening. The first perspective is information processing. The second one is listening from a competent behavior perspective. And the third one is individual differences and their impact on listening comprehension. So let's go through these three perspectives and see how we can define listening from these perspectives. At the end, you will find out that although these perspectives have differences, they also have some overlaps and commonalities. So the first perspective is from the information processing approach. And this is actually, the historical background of information processing models and approaches to listening comprehension or just listening is quite interesting. But I'm going to just present a very brief one here at the interest of time. The dominance of behaviorism in psychology before the emergence of cognitive revolution is evident. But basically, there were just few empirical studies of listening in the first half of the 20th century. That was when the behaviorism was quite dominant. But after the so-called cognitive revolutions, which began in the 1950s, we observed the rise of human information processing models. And some of these models actually were exclusively developed to describe and define the process of listening and listening comprehension. So listening was defined as the cognitive activity of selection, organization, and integration. By selection, those scholars were referring to the process of attention and perception. Attention is the process of fixing your mind on something or fixating your eyes on something. When you're paying attention to something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are understanding or you're comprehending that phenomenon. That only means that you are devoting your cognitive resources to that phenomenon or to that person or to that object. Now, perception means it's a process in which through a physiological kind of process, you receive the stimuli. That's the message. Here it could be a verbal message or an auditory message, or it could be a visual one. For example, when you're reading a text or something, then you send those through the nervous system to the right parts of the brain. I mean, the parts of the brain that are responsible for or that are associated with the processing of those pieces of information that you obtain from the environment. So that's perception. But the fact that you perceive something does not mean that you also understand it. During the process of organization, perhaps we can say the comprehension starts. So if you perceive something and you attend to it, you still do not understand it unless the process of organization starts. Organization has to do with interpretation, and interpretation takes place at two levels. One of them is literal and the other one is inferential in listening. Literal comprehension is also known as bottom-up processing, and top-down, and inferential processing refers to top-down processing. That's in other words, the other word or the other terminology that's used for inferential processing or inferential comprehension is top-down processing. I'll talk about these two concepts in the next slides. Then comes the process of integration. Integration is a process through which you store the information that you have collected and you have processed, and then also the process of recalling it or retrieving it from your long-term memory. So if you assign that piece of information that you have understood to your long-term memory, and during the same activity or later, if you recall or retrieve it from your long-term memory, that's called integration. But you integrate it with the knowledge base that you have already collected and you have already stored in your long-term memory. Information processing models primarily look at listening as a linear model. Perhaps this is a limitation because we know that listening comprehension is not completely linear. It could get quite nonlinear. The other thing about these models is that they try to look into three dimensions of these three cognitive activities. The first one is the time course of every stage or every cognitive activity. The second one is the nature of that activity. That's the definition which I talked about. And the last one is the nature of the memory systems in which these activities take place. Actually, there are two memory systems. One of them is long-term memory, which I have already discussed. And the other one, which is perhaps equally important, is working memory, which I will briefly discuss in the next slides. So that's about information processing, which views listening as a tripartite kind of process, which includes listening, organization, and integration. Now, how about listening as competent behavior? Well, this framework is based on communication or communicative competence. And it focuses on the overt behavior and the measurement of listening as interaction, as well as the relationships between communicators. So as I have discussed in other previous videos, and I will leave the links in the comments section in this video, the communicative competency models do not necessarily focus on what is going on in the mind or in the brain of listeners or communicators. Rather, they focus on what they can do most often. So listening competency, therefore, in this approach is judged by others, not necessarily by the person himself or by a test. So it makes the process of evaluating the listening competency of listeners a bit tricky and perhaps difficult. The process of assessing who is a better listener and who is not as good listener includes the reports that you get from others, third-party assessments, and also through a process which is called critical incident technique, and it refers to the participants' recall and retrieval of a time when a behavior or occurrence impacted a specific outcome. So it actually includes interviewing the listener and asking them, for example, do you think that you were understanding certain things as you were speaking with someone? Do you think that you had difficulty understanding that person when he was talking about this and that and that? So it's like a self-report kind of process, but perhaps the most reliable and valid approach in this perspective is the third-party reports that are provided by other people. Now, there are three assumptions underlying the competent behavior in this approach. These three assumptions include perceptual, contextual, and functional assumptions. So what is the first one? The first one holds that listening competency is perceptual. In other words, listening competency is a perceived achievement of interaction goals, and is determined and it can determine the success of listening, which means that actually listening competency is quite subjective. It's a perceived achievement of interaction goals, meaning that if you are in an interaction with someone else, you're listening to that person, if that person is satisfied that you have achieved the goal of interaction, then he would say that you are a competent listener. Whereas another person, like a third party who's listening to you guys having a conversation, might not necessarily be satisfied with your performance on that test. Sorry, on that task, or it could be a test as well. Which means that, as I said, in this perspective, competency is a subjective concept rather than an objective concept, and it depends on who is trying to evaluate or assess your competency of listening. Then the second attribute of listening here is that listening competency is contextualized, which means that is affected by situational and also the situational factors and the relationship between the two people. For example, you might be a better listener in a friendly conversation or in a chit-chat as compared with listening in a lecture, because in a lecture at a university, you'll have to listen more deeply and you'll have to tap onto your world knowledge and actually listen very carefully to everything that is said. You may not have a chance to ask the tutor or the lecturer to repeat something, especially if it's a large lecture theater. On the other hand, if you're in a conversation or in a chat with a friend, you can always ask for repetition. You don't have to involve in a very deep kind of listening, but a shallow listening will do. And finally, listening competency is functional in this approach, meaning that you listen and you're getting involved in interactions in order to accomplish certain goals. So some of these goals include, for example, directional goals, or exchanging information goals, or expressing feelings and emotions, and so on and so forth. So that's about listening as a competent behavior. And then I'm going to move to the last one, which is listening as individual differences.